Good morning. Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming for this talk. I will talk about spectral quality, how to improve colors to improve a video. My name is Vittorio Giovara. I'm a senior engineer at Vimeo, but I'm also an open source contributor, a member of several open source communities such as Videolan and FFmpeg. For those who don't know, Vimeo is the largest ad-free Vimeo streaming platform. It is a company founded in 2004, and we were the first ones to stream HD video in 2007. Since this talk is about colors, I would like also mention that we were also the first ones to stream color-accurate videos. The colors are very important for creators and artists. What happened was that in the early age of technology, in the 1800s, artist movements were supplanted by photography, in black and white photography. This brought since the shape of an object was now so easy to represent, this led several painters and artists to use color as a new form of expression. And this has been true also in the evolution of pictures in movement, like movies. And we can see it in several new and old movies that color is a way to express something. I'd like to mention a couple of examples. This is The Last Emperor by Bertolucci. It's the story of in ancient China, and it reflects heavily how the yellow and the red colors are important in the Chinese culture. Then there is Billy Elliot, which is the story of a coming of age of this young man, and who is represented by yellow, whereas his father, like a strong figure, is represented with light blue. And we can see that this is one of the scenes of the ending of the movie, which both Billy Elliot and his father are surrounded by yellow because the father has been accepting the evolution of his son. And then we have animated movies like Kung Fu Panda, in which especially from the second and the third movies play a lot with colors. They represent enemies with red and blue colors, and the protagonists with the gold colors, leaving the green as a sort of neutral field in the renewal. We see that colors are really important for videos, but we can't talk about colors if we don't talk about eye anatomy. Colors are nothing more than how our brain interprets the wavelengths of light that we receive. The eyes are marvelous machines. The pupil focuses the light on the back of the eye, which is filled with the cones and rod cells that capture different portion of light and convert it into electrical impulses that go to our brain. And it's amazing how these cells are so specialized that they can see colors in two different ways, either with the red, green, and blue in RGB, but they can also see at the same time the luminance and two color components of light. This actually helped us model how we treat color in technology. We can't use an infinite field like wavelengths of lights. So we agree on selecting a few particular wavelengths and associate a particular color to those wavelengths. And this creates a model. The model helps us as if it was the language on which we can start talking about colors. And the most common and most widespread way is to just assign 2 coordinates and map every visible color on a diagram, also called a chromaticity diagram, in which every color is mapped by an x and y coordinate. This is a simplified diagram because in reality the model is still a 3D space. We just take a cross section of average luminance, which is the one that is most commonly used. This is not enough. We have the model, which is really good, but we also need something else when we talk about colors. We need a color space. So if the model is the language, the color space is the grammar. And the color space is defined by point coordinates. That's called the primaries. The primaries are just three coordinates that define the area of the diagram that is being broadcast or transmitted. And the area is defined the gamut of the color space. How do we select an appropriate gamut? Well, we leverage on the work made by Dr. Pointer, who sampled every visible color and mapped the color of every object to the chromaticity diagram. This was at the end of the 80s, and at the early 90s, a standardization body selected a triangle to try to encompass most of the visible light. What's inside of the pointer's gamut is colors that are actually existing in nature, whereas everything outside are colors that we can see, but they don't exist. They are artificial colors. And this was the first one that was widely used. Was the BT601, and which is almost the same as the SMPT 170M. And going on with the technology, we slowly increased the area in order to be able to transmit more and more colors every iteration. So if BT601 was used for SD videos, BT709 is used for HD video, and then display P3, and BT2020 are used for Ultra HD videos. You can see that BT2020 is the first one that is able to include the whole pointer's gamut. And a final note on the chromaticity diagram: you can have multiple ways to represent the same diagram, but it doesn't really change. The point is, the larger the color space, the better for the number of colors that you can use to showcase in a video. The color space is defined usually in a specification. The ITU is the one that standardized the most of them. Besides the primaries, it defines 2 other properties that are essential for a color space. One is the matrix coefficient, and the other is the transfer function. The matrix coefficient is simply a way to convert RGB data, which is hard to compress and hard to broadcast, and instead use a different compression system, such as YCBCR, which is a derivative of the YUV format. And using these matrix coefficients, you can convert losslessly between RGB, for example, and YCBCR. The second point is the transfer characteristic, which is very important to get right. This was something introduced in the early days of television. The screen that was used, the glass that was used in a cathode television, introduced a shift in the color in the light transmitted, in the light received in the homes. And since the engineers didn't want that shifted to modify to make either the image too dark or too light. They modeled the curve, and they applied this curve, the inverse of this curve, to the original signal. This is what we call the gamma correction. The gamma correction is nothing else that pre-converting the signal with a specific curve, and then in a way that the screen of the television will be able to represent the image, the light linearly, as if it was originally encoded. I say this is the most interesting pointer because it was actually not standardized until the late 2011 using BT 1886, and it was basically the BT 709 curve standardized as an official standard dynamic range, standard range video, which it's also interesting to note that since we usually transmit video at 8-bit, increasing the number of bits would prevent us to having a need of this non-linearity. If we were able to transmit 16 bits of data, we would need no actual curve. But the problem is that 16 bits of data per component is a lot of data. And so rather than increasing the number of bits, researchers focused on improving the curves. And this has led to the research movement of the high dynamic range, or HDR. HDR is the new way, we could say, to emit more light from the screen, rather than being limited to all the 100 nits or candela per square meter of light that a normal screen can emit. HDR screens can emit much more light, and this allows us to see many more colors. The only problem with that is that everything in the transmission chain needs to be updated. And everything from the camera to the encoder to the broadcasting equipment needs to be updated. And I hope that at the end of this presentation, I will have convinced you to upgrade it. Another requirement is the need of 10-bit. You can use HDR with 8-bit content, but it's not looking very good. Since most companies are updating their encoder, they're switching to either VP9, HEVC, or AV1. A lot of services are upgrading to 10-bit at the same time as the switch codecs. And this is something that it's very useful and very simple to do because you get a 10-bit for free, almost. There are two most common curves that are defined in a specification, the BT 2100. There is in this specification we have it's just in any other specification. We have the matrix coefficients, the transfer characteristic, and the color primaries. A note on the dynamic range, though, is something that is limited by our eyes. So when we analyze and compare HDR, we have to be particularly careful about what is being broadcasted as what the light is, how much light is emitted. Our eyes don't actually have such a high dynamic range. It would be as if we look through a window and then we look immediately inside a darker room. Our eyes would take some time to adapt to the new environment. And also the amount of light is directly related with the kind of device you're handling. For example, I heard that the new iPhone 10 has only 600 nits, and it's, whereas new HDR technology broadcasts 10,000 nits, but for a device that's small and that is being used in plain daylight, 600 nits is actually perfectly fine. Let's go to the most popular curves that are used in the market. The first one is HLG. It's the one, the hybrid log gamma. It's the one developed by BBC and NHK and standardized as STD-SB76. It's a screen-referred curve. That means it defines how the camera should capture the light. And has some very nice properties. The first one is that it's backward compatible with the existing curve. It will take its toll in the terms of brightness, but if I try to watch HLG HDR video on a SDR screen, I will still be able to get most of the colors right. And the second point is how the curve can modify itself depending on the viewing conditions. Since a lot of televisions do have a light sensor to adjust for brightness, the HLG curve can also adjust itself to improve the color, the amount of light emitted depending on the darkness or brightness of the room. In this first graph, I show how we can see how the SDR in red, the SDR curve in red, saturates at a certain point, and how the hybrid log gamma curve instead matches most of the curve, and the area between the red and the blue curve is the amount of light that I'm not able to emit while in backward compatible mode. But it's still a good property nonetheless. And the second curve represents how the HLG curve can modify itself depending on the viewing condition. The second curve is a PQ. It stands for perceptual quantizer. It's a standard developed by Dolby and is published as SMPT 2084. It's a new kind of curve. It defines how the screen should emit light instead of the camera sensor. And it's modeled after a 10,000 nits screen. The concept is relatively simple. Every light level, every bit level has a different light level. This curve is used as a marketing term in HDR10, which is a collection of BT 2020, SMPT 2084, and SMPT 2086, which is something that allows us to broadcast a PQ signal, even though there is not a screen capable of emitting the whole BT 2020 gamut, and there is not a screen capable of emitting 10,000 nits of light. One point about this series of recommendations is that they are not backward compatible. Like the colors would be distorted if I would try to watch a PQ HDR video on SDR screen. So we always need, when we use this standard, we always need a second rendition, a so-called tone map file. The tone map is something that brings back the colors that are outside the visible range and brings that into the gamut of the colors that is available on my screen. The SMPT 2086 defined the so-called metadata. The mastering display color volume is as I mentioned, since there is no screen capable of displaying the whole BT 2020 gamut, the editing software records the primaries of the mastering display, that is, of the system where mastering took place, and allows this to represent correctly the colors as the grader engineer intended. For example, if the largest gamut is the BT2020 gamut, if I were to apply the mastering metadata on a limited gamut screen, I would be able to signal this in the mastering display and advertise my colors as contained in a BT2020 color space. The second kind of metadata that are still needed for HDR10 is the content light level information. And again, since there is no screen capable of emitting 10,000 nits of light, we determine the maximum amount of light used inside the video. In this way, the screen can adapt itself and avoid clipping the too bright scenes and only use the levels that are actually visible in my video. There are several variations of this metadata. Other popular ones are the Dolby Vision, which is a different encoding system, as well as dynamic metadata that is in which the metadata changes per frame. It does require additional complex encoding settings, and it's something that is being developed right now. There are more and more curves arising, but I like to focus on the two curves, and PQ and HLG, and if we were to compare them point to point, there is one big problem of HLG that I would like to point out. It's actually British. In reality, like, the HLG is much simpler to implement, and it's backward compatible, which are very interesting properties for anybody dealing with video. One additional point that is a particular pet peeve of mine is that HLG is a free specification, whereas PQ and all the HDR10 specifications, they are behind a paywall. But in practice, it's hard to choose a winner. You have to determine the one that is better suited for the kind of audience you are broadcasting to. My own advice would be to research and decide on what you want to do. And I particularly recommend the work by the EBU, which is working on a subjective evaluation for HDR signals. And whereas at the same time, I would be weary of one-sided technical papers, such as the one published by Dolby about HLG, which contains several p-traps that you have to be careful and inform yourself on what you have to choose. Despite everything, I think that HDR is one of the best technologies that happened in video. It's something that does not require additional bandwidth requirement. You don't need accessories. And like a 3D television, you don't need glasses. You don't need a VR headset. It's, I would say, a classic new means of expression that is compatible with what we have now. For example, if we were to watch a 1080p video, but in HDR, it would be better than just watching a 1080p without HDR. On this point, Vimeo's approach has been trying to support this new mean of technology, as the creator appreciate. We will be on the lookout for new curves, new standards, but it's something that people seem to enjoy. We recently surpassed the more than 2% of uploads are 10 bit or more. And in the effort of always serving the best quality possible, we will probably serve additional codec and additional resolution for getting to all supported devices. And the problem of quality is something that has been always fascinating. And we've been increasing the size of the video. The video technology has been increasing the number of resolution available. We went from 720p to 4K, 8K. It's a good way to improve quality, but it's something that has limits. It especially depends on the viewing condition and the size of the screen. So you can't just throw more pixel and hope the video will look better. We can add the frames so that we improve the temporal quality, in which we increase the number of frames per second that are displayed. This saves one particular problem, which is the motion blur. But a lot of people actually like the cinema effect of fewer frames. So it's a very difficult point to improve. And finally, we have the spectral quality, the point of this talk, in which we increase the number of bits to improve the gradients and the amount of colors that we are able to show. That is not enough. We also improve the amount of light. So since we have more colors, we also need more light to be able to tell colors apart. And HDR is, of course, a very good example of how we can achieve that. But at the end of the day, the rush for quality is, of course, something that is very important for economical reasons. It improves your brand. It helps you sell a product. But that is not the only reason to upgrade, to improve quality. There are actually health benefits and the improvements on the life of people, according to this research group. This study, Immersive, Emotive, and Cognitive Effects of HD TV, was a study run in Paris at the early 2010. And there were two groups that watched an SD video and an HD video. And the results were incredible. Like viewers were spending 25% longer time by watching HD content rather than SD content. And the perceived duration falls. So we have users that are will watch longer and will enjoy more something that is broadcasted at HD. And also a very important point, they surprised even the researcher, was that the audience are able to perceive and retain the information that we try to convey for longer and with more accuracy. And I would say in this age of information media, social network and fake news, if we're able to convey something and have the audience actually learn and get what we are trying to say clearly, is actually a very cool thing. Thank you. Yeah, of course. So the question is whether HDR10 and Dolby Vision are supported on television, and whether we need to, whether the system needs to be upgraded to support both. So my point on this talk was more on the service providers. A service provider will need to supply something that for the new generation television, for the HDR television, and with the SDR, and with the new with the older SDR television, because most of the televisions are SDR. So a service provider will, by using HDR10, it will need to save two different versions, one for HDR and the other one for SDR. And it will need to apply some tone map in order to derive the compatible version. The beauty of HLG is that you don't need that. You just need the one single master file, and you will be able to broadcast it in a way that both HDR and SDR televisions will be able to render it correctly. So this is why also HLG is used more in broadcasting and archival, whereas Dolby Vision and HDR10 are used for streaming provider. Yes.
Which ones are most widely supported by the television, and who pays the royalties? The television manufacturers, the encoders, or the content owners?
The question is who pays for royalties and which is the most deployed system, the most supported system by televisions. Interestingly enough, there are no known patents for HDR. HLG is a specification developed by BBC, who left all the patents. They grant a royalty-free license, whereas PQ is a proprietary technology, but it's also for the static metadata part. It's also royalty-free. Regarding televisions, it's somewhat an unexplored territory. Most of the televisions seems to support PQ curves, but more and more televisions are actually implementing HLG because HLG sounds more interesting to broadcasters. And so at the end of the day, they will probably support both of them.
Basically, I have to shoot the camera HDR signal originally, correct?
Yeah.
Then on the encoder side, what should I make sure on the encoder side that it passes through the HDR signal?
So the question is, what do we have to do on the broadcasting side besides shooting in HDR? Like, what do we need to do for the encoding level? The encoding level is the encoder needs to support HDR in the sense that it needs to preserve the color properties, the matrix, the transfer, and the primaries. And in the case of PQ, it also needs to support passing through the master and display metadata and the color volume, which are usually either provided by the camera or they are provided by the grading tools that are usually performed in post. Any other question? Thank you very much for your time.